Good morning, Dan and Amy. What is up? I'll tell you what's up. Mark Steyn has a new book, and it is always a treat to talk to Mark Steyn. You know Mark Steyn, Amy, from books such as America Alone, After American. Actually, you know what my favorite Mark Steyn book is?
Which one?
Passing Parade. It's this collection of obituaries of famous people that is gives you interesting facts about some of these famous people you didn't know, and also it's hilarious.
My favorite work of Mark Steyn was his Christmas album.
No, well, yeah, he is a sort
He's
of
a singer.
sort of a Renaissance man. It's true. And his new book is A Disgrace to the Profession. He takes on the junk scientists of the world, most specifically Michael Mann, who Michael Mann and Mark Steyn, their litigation has now replaced Bill Buckley and Gore Vidal as like the seminal conservative liberal litigation of the last 50 years, I think. Mark Steyn joins us now. Thanks so much for joining us, Mark.
Hey, Dad. Hi, Amy. Great to be with you, and thank you for that, Amy. It's never too early to start playing Marshmallow World. I expect it to be put into high rotation for the rest of the week.
Well, sure, it is after Labor Day, so the Christmas shopping season is upon us. So, Mark, let's just give a bit of the backstory on this legal battle you have with this scientist, quotation marks, Michael Mann. That it provides kind of the centerpiece of your new book, A Disgrace to the Profession, and the controversy over Mr. Mann's so-called hockey stick describing climate change.
Well, this is the most famous science graph of the 21st century. It's the one that was used by every Western nation, apart from the United States, to justify signing the Kyoto Accord. It's the most influential graph. It was in Al Gore's Oscar-winning movie. It's taught to school children, basically from kindergarten and first grade all the way up to when they graduate, and it's a cartoon. It eliminates all natural climate variability of the Middle Ages, the medieval warm period, and the Little Ice Age that followed. Nothing happened in the entire history of climate until you, Dan, and you, Amy, got into your SUVs and, boom, sent the mercury rocketing up through the top of the thermometer, and now the planet's going to broil. And I thought it was an obvious joke, and I described it as such, and he sued me, and we're in fourth year at the District of Columbia Superior Court, and with no end in sight. And I thought, as I had all this trial material sitting around clogging up my rec room, I might as well stick some of it in a book. And it's really the story, I think, of the politicization of science and the corruption of science that leads to fellas like Obama standing up and announcing that the temperature in Alaska is going to increase by 12 degrees between now and the end of the century, which is ridiculous. And it results in people like Al Gore and the Prince of Wales predicting that the world is going to end in 10 years, which I think Al Gore's expiration date is actually next year. And the Prince of Wales, his one gives an extra 18 months. So Al Gore's Inferno will hit, I think, January next year, and the Prince of Wales's Inferno will hit in the early summer of 2017. But basically, that's why I wrote a short book, because if Al Gore's right, you won't have time to start any long books. There's no point. If you haven't read War and Peace now, forget it. If you start now, the end of the world will kick in January. You're never going to get through it.
Spray those aerosol cans while you can, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, was this cathartic to put this into a book? Was it a way of dealing with the lawsuit and the litigation that's still staring you in the face?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I were to lose the case, it's a basic free speech case, and it's surprising to me because they present it as, I'm an insane, fringe, crazy, right-wing extremist, which is all true.
Right.
But
absolute defense to defamation.
It's basically grounds for the insanity defense. But all the fellas like the ACLU. The Chicago Tribune, interestingly, and most major media organizations, NBC News, the Washington Post, and so forth, have all filed amicus briefs against Michael Mann and his science, because if he were to win, it would be the biggest setback for free speech in the American courts in half a century. So I'm not, I don't know why it fell to me to have to bear this burden. But in the event that we were to lose, we'd be going to the Supreme Court. So, I'd have to get I'm going to have to get like a 30-year extension on my green card just to see this case through. So it looks like if that happens, it'll be going all the way. But it would be a major setback for free speech.
Well, and the interesting thing about your book, the book is A Disgrace to the Profession. The thing that I like is it really is a compendium of scientists talking about the science, and all of them essentially suggesting in scientific detail what you summarize by just calling the hockey stick fraudulent, that including one a PhD, a meteorologist and climatologist, said today most scientists dismiss the hockey stick. There's criticisms from scientists in your book about the lack of reproducibility of the hockey stick. So what's the case?
Well, basically, normally in science, if you were to have something that overturns conventional wisdom, like if you were to overturn, if you, Dan, were to say this whole Isaac Newton and gravity, Sir Isaac got it completely wrong, there is no such thing as gravity, people would say, well, that seems like a big change in the way we're used to thinking about these things. What's your proof?
Yes.
Nobody said, because it was politically convenient, when this guy basically abolished natural climate variability. I mean, at one time, the whole of Canada was under a sheet of ice, and there was nothing up there. Now, I know most of you guys in Chicago think it's still under a sheet of ice and there's nothing up there, but, it's warmed up a bit since then because we've had natural climate variability. People don't understand that to get that shape, showing that 20th century warming is unprecedented, he relied on two things. He relied on some California bristle cones, which tell you whether it's wet and tell you about CO2 rather than tell you the temperature. And for the first half of the 15th century, he relied on two trees in the Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec to tell you the temperature for the entire northern hemisphere. Everyone thinks, oh, this must be science. He must have got thousands and thousands of pieces of research, and he must have checked and rechecked and re-rechecked. No, for the years up to 1429, he had one magic Canadian tree predict the temperature for the entire planet. And he was so careless. He only had one tree. That was the only data he had. It's not even data. It's datum. It's singular. There's so little data. There's just one of it. And he didn't even get that right because he counted it twice. And you've only got one piece of research, and you accidentally count it twice. And when you look at it, the whole story that young people now have been force-fed, that this is hotter than it's ever been, that the 1998 was the hottest year of the hottest decade of the hottest century ever, is complete bunk, and there's no evidence for it.
Why are you the target of all of these thought police and these speech crimes that you commit? We've got this one in this country, this civil case. You were brought up by in some Star Chamber proceeding up in Canada for speech code violations there. Why are you always being targeted?
Well, I don't look for it. I'd be quite happy just to do as Amy was saying and just make my little Christmas album. I don't seek it, and actually, that's probably the one thing I should be sued for. But I don't seek them. But I do think, as a general principle, that in my battles with the Canadian Islamic Congress and the hate speech laws in Canada, where the Parliament wound up actually repealing that hate speech law, I've learned both down south and over in Britain and Europe and Australia and throughout the Western world that we live in an age which is actually not terribly friendly to free speech. And you see it in large, big ways and small. You see it on the climate change issue. You see it on Islam. You see it on almost anything, any subject that is worth discussing at an American campus. You can't discuss it except within the very narrow and getting narrower approved lines. And I actually think the sort of dimming of the lights on free speech is actually one of the big issues. If you can't talk about a subject, if you can't even mention it, then you can't have an honest debate about it. That applies to everything. That applies to immigration. at the southern border here. It applies to what's happening over in Europe with the great migratory tide at the moment. If you're not allowed to discuss these issues honestly, then basically we're no longer living in free societies. So the free speech issue is important.
Well, let's talk about those European refugees. There's a call now for the U.S. to take 65,000 refugees. Do you think that's a good idea, bad idea, considering one needle in the haystack, one person might be a jihadist?
Well, it's not just one person. I mean, this does not have... This is the biggest movement of people since the end of the Second World War. And at the end of the Second World War, families moved because people wanted to have hope for the future. So people traveled with their guys traveled with their wives and little children. In the people showing up on Europe's borders via Turkey and the Mediterranean, 75% of them are men, and they're almost all young men. The women and children have been left behind. These are not refugees. There are more men in this supposed family refugee demographic in Europe. It has a higher male proportion of the population than the U.S. Army does at the moment. In other words, it's got the demographics of an invading army. It's overwhelmingly young males. It's not a refugee problem. It's something else entirely. And it's these when you look at the photographs, they're almost all fit, vigorous young men. They don't look like the refugees of the Second World War or the population displacements when India and Pakistan split in 1947. It's something entirely different going on here.
Before we let you jump, Mark Steyn, I want to ask you a domestic political question. Everybody's trying to explain the Trump phenomenon, one form or another. You had an interesting piece on this. We're getting all kinds of new terminology as like a political science course. Walter Russell Mead talks about popular nihilism. Peggy Noonan says America's in play. You talk about bipartisan extremism as a way to explain the Trump phenomenon in part. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, when people say, oh, he's not conservative on this and he's not conservative on that, that's actually what we mean by moderates. When we look at the people who determine elections, the sort of people in the middle who determine which way the 51-49 split goes, they're people who often hold actually contradictory positions. They're in favor of, say, single-payer health care, but they also want all the illegal immigrants sent home. That's not a moderate. That's someone who's holding an extreme left position and extreme right position. And Trump is actually tapping into something here. And the reason why it's effective with the Republican Party is because this is a two-party system in which one party has been generally at the national level entirely useless for most of the 21st century. And I think that's the issue here. You know, what difference would it make if Boehner and McConnell went to the Bahamas for 2 years and left cardboard cutouts sitting in their chairs?
Right.
And it's because there's no compelling answer to that that I think Trump has managed to sort of hijack the Republican Party. And if he succeeds, you know, some of these polls show he could get 25% of the black vote. He's actually got quite a strong... Some of these so-called contradictory positions actually have quite strong cross-party appeal, and it could be if he's up against Hillary. I think that Trump versus Hillary. I think Trump could well end up in the White House on that scenario.
He is the always insightful and entertaining Mark Steyn. His new book, A Disgrace to the Profession. Mark Steyn, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Amy.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.